Hey, medic! Where's the field hospital you got lost from?
Captain Maverick Braxton's harsh laughter echoed across the NATO training compound, drawing every pair of eyes toward the small figure clutching a worn backpack. Harlow Thorne, 24 years old, stood among the elite trainees like a misplaced puzzle piece. Gray t-shirt wrinkled, faded khaki pants, blonde curls tied in a practical high bun that somehow made her look even younger. Her porcelain skin dotted with freckles across her nose and cheeks, those striking blue eyes that should have commanded attention instead seemed to invite dismissal. "I registered for logistics training," Harlow said quietly, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who'd learned early that speaking softly often meant people listened harder. Braxton slapped his knee, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "Logistics? Little girl, this is NATO elite training camp, not summer camp for wannabes." He turned to his crew, voice pitched perfectly to carry across the entire courtyard. "Who let this kid through security? Standards really are dropping." Cruel laughter erupted like fireworks. Phones emerged from pockets, live streams beginning to roll. Nobody knew that in exactly 18 minutes, when that gray t-shirt would be torn away to reveal a skull crowned with a queen's diadem inked in black, the entire world would understand they'd just witnessed the biggest mistake of their military careers. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the Virginia compound, where 200 of the world's most promising military candidates had gathered for NATO's elite cross-training program. This wasn't basic training. This was where Navy SEALs met British SAS, where Delta Force operators shared techniques with German KSK commandos, the cream of the crop, handpicked from their respective special forces units. And then there was Harlow. Braxton stood 6 feet 2 inches of pure intimidation, his broad shoulders straining against digital camouflage that looked like it had been tailored specifically for his frame. At 28, he commanded respect through presence alone, the kind of officer who had never met a challenge he couldn't dominate. His crew flanked him like a pack of wolves. Sergeant Tyler Blackwood, the technical specialist with arms covered in unit tattoos, Corporal Rex Hawthorne, the demolitions expert whose grin never quite reached his calculating eyes, and Private First Class Duke Morrison, barely 21, but already carrying himself like he owned the world. "Seriously, though," Braxton continued, his voice dripping with theatrical concern, "did someone call Make-A-Wish? Because this is just sad." The crowd was growing. Elite trainees from 12 different nations were abandoning their gear checks and formation drills to witness what was clearly going to be the day's entertainment. Among them, a figure moved with different energy entirely. Lieutenant Paisley Aldridge emerged from the administrative building, her auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, uniform crisp despite the early hour. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every promotion the hard way. When her eyes found Harlow, something flickered across her features. Recognition, concern, maybe even fear. But Harlow didn't notice. She was focused on setting her backpack down, and in that simple movement, those watching closely might have observed something unusual. Her feet positioned themselves automatically, shoulder-width apart, weight distributed evenly. Her spine straightened not with conscious effort, but with muscle memory so deep it had become involuntary. For just a moment, she looked less like a lost medical student and more like someone who'd spent years learning to stand ready for anything. If this story of hidden strength and military justice already has you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button right now and subscribe for more incredible tales that reveal the warrior spirit within ordinary people. Before we continue with Harlow's story, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Are you a military family member, a veteran, or someone who simply believes in standing up for the underestimated? Drop a comment and let me know your country and what drew you to this story. Your support means everything. And now let's see what happens when Harlow's quiet strength meets military arrogance. The hazing began immediately. As Harlow approached the equipment station, Sergeant Knox, a grizzled man who had been issuing gear longer than most of these trainees had been alive, looked her up and down with unconcealed skepticism. "Logistics, huh?" Knox's weathered hands rifled through a pile of uniforms. "Well, we'll start you with the basics. Hope you're not afraid of getting dirty." He tossed her a uniform that was clearly 2 sizes too large, watching with amusement as she caught it without fumbling. What Knox didn't expect was the way her fingers immediately assessed the fabric weight, the reinforcement stitching, the quality of the zippers. She handled the gear like someone evaluating equipment specifications, not someone grateful just to be included. Something wrong with the uniform, Princess? Blackwood had materialized beside Knox's station, his voice carrying that particular brand of mockery that military hierarchy made possible. No, sir, Harlow replied, but her fingers were still testing the fabric quality in a way that spoke of extensive experience with tactical gear. Just checking the specifications. Blackwood laughed. Specifications? It's clothing, not rocket science. You planning to write a review? What none of them noticed was how Harlow's eyes had already cataloged every exit from the equipment area. 3 doors, 2 windows, 1 emergency exit partially concealed behind a supply rack. Her gaze lingered on each for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to assess approach routes and potential obstacles, not long enough to draw attention. It was the kind of tactical awareness that took years to develop and couldn't be taught in any classroom. The live stream was picking up viewers. Braxton's phone showed over 300 people watching as he provided commentary. Okay, NATO family, you're seeing this live. Someone actually thought logistics clerk belonged in elite training. This is going to be comedy gold. But Paisley Aldridge was watching from a different angle entirely. She recognized the way Harlow moved through space. Economical, purposeful, never quite relaxed. It was the movement pattern of someone who had spent time in places where relaxation could get you killed. Hey, Braxton, Paisley called out, her voice carrying enough authority to pause the mockery. Maybe ease up a little. First day nerves hit everyone different. Braxton turned, his grin widening. Oh, look. Lieutenant Mom is here to protect her little duckling. Don't worry, Paisley, we're just having some fun. Right, medic? Harlow's response was barely audible. Yes, sir. But something in those 2 words made Paisley's blood run cold. She'd heard that particular tone before. The careful neutrality of someone who could end a conversation permanently, but chose not to. It was the voice of a predator pretending to be prey. The weapons inspection came next, conducted in the main armory under the watchful eye of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who took pride in maintaining the finest equipment standards in the NATO system. Each trainee was required to demonstrate basic weapon safety and handling with an M4 carbine before being cleared for advanced training. Harlow approached the weapons station with appropriate hesitation, reaching for the rifle like someone who'd maybe seen one in movies but never held the real thing. Her grip looked uncertain, her stance awkward. Rodriguez stepped closer, ready to provide basic instruction to someone clearly out of their depth. But the moment Harlow's hands made contact with the weapon, something shifted. The uncertainty vanished, replaced by movements so fluid they looked choreographed. Her grip adjusted automatically to the optimal position, her stance shifted into perfect isosceles form, and she performed a brass check with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times. The entire sequence took less than 10 seconds, but Rodriguez had been around firearms long enough to recognize the difference between training and instinct. This wasn't someone who'd been taught proper weapon handling. This was someone for whom proper weapon handling had become as natural as breathing. Where did you learn to do that? Rodriguez asked quietly, his training skepticism giving way to professional curiosity. Harlow's response was carefully casual. Basic training, Sergeant, just like everyone else. But Rodriguez had trained thousands of soldiers over his career, and he'd never seen anyone transition from apparent incompetence to expert handling that seamlessly. He made a mental note to check her training records more carefully. From across the armory, Colonel Marcus Ashford observed the interaction with growing interest. Ashford had built his career on attention to detail and the ability to spot anomalies before they became problems. At 52, his position as camp administrator gave him access to every trainee's background file, and Harlow Thorne's file was interesting. Most of the relevant details were classified above his clearance level, which was unusual for someone supposedly assigned to logistics support. Her previous duty stations were redacted, her training history showed gaps that didn't align with her stated experience, and her medical records indicated treatment for injuries that seemed inconsistent with rear echelon service. Ashford prided himself on running the tightest program in NATO. Every trainee was here for a reason, their backgrounds thoroughly vetted, their capabilities precisely matched to program requirements. Harlow Thorne represented a puzzle he didn't like, and puzzles in his program had a way of becoming problems. The afternoon brought barracks assignments, and Harlow found herself in Building C, 3rd floor, room 14. The moment she entered the space, her behavior shifted again. While other trainees focused on claiming the best bunks or complaining about the Spartan accommodations, Harlow was conducting what could only be described as a security assessment. She checked the window locks, tested the structural integrity of the door frame, and positioned her gear in a way that provided clear sight lines to both the entrance and the emergency exit. Her movements were subtle enough that casual observation might miss them, but anyone with tactical training would recognize the pattern of someone establishing a defensive position. Her roommate was Private Jessica Warner, a communications specialist from the Australian Defence Force, who'd earned her place through superior technical skills and an infectious enthusiasm for military life. Warner bounced into the room like someone attending the world's most exciting sleepover, chattering about the training schedule while Harlow methodically arranged her minimal belongings. "So, what's your specialty?" Warner asked, settling onto her chosen bunk with casual familiarity. "I heard your logistics, but that's pretty broad. Supply chain, transportation, medical support." "General logistics support," Harlow replied, her tone suggesting the conversation was closed. But Warner was the kind of person who viewed closed conversations as personal challenges. "Come on, there's got to be more to it than that. Nobody gets into NATO elite training for general anything. What's your background? Where were you stationed before this?" Harlow's pause lasted just long enough to be noticeable. "Fort Bragg. Administrative support mostly." The lie came smoothly, but Warner had grown up in a military family and knew the difference between someone who'd spent time pushing paperwork and someone who'd spent time in the field. Harlow's hands were too calloused, her awareness too sharp, her gear arrangement too tactical for someone whose primary experience was administrative. Dinner was served in the main mess hall, a cavernous space designed to accommodate 500 personnel, but currently hosting only the 200 elite trainees and their instructional staff. The social dynamics were immediately apparent: national units clustering together, specialists gravitating toward their professional peers, informal hierarchies establishing themselves through subtle displays of dominance and deference. Harlow carried her tray to an empty table in the far corner, selecting a seat that provided clear sight lines to all entrances while keeping her back to a solid wall. She ate in silence, seemingly oblivious to the conversation swirling around her, but anyone watching closely would have noticed her eyes constantly moving, cataloging faces, noting group dynamics, identifying potential threats and allies with the systematic precision of someone conducting reconnaissance. Braxton noticed. He'd been holding court at the central table, regaling his audience with stories of previous training exercises, while keeping one eye on the entertainment potential of their logistics stray. When he saw Harlow sitting alone, clearly vulnerable and isolated, he sensed opportunity. "Hey boys," he announced loudly enough to quiet nearby conversations. "Looks like our little medic could use some company. What do you say we go introduce ourselves properly?" The approach was theatrical, designed to maximize audience impact. Braxton led his crew across the mess hall like a general reviewing troops, their bootsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. By the time they reached Harlow's table, most of the hall was watching. "Evening, logistics," Braxton said, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "Thought you might be lonely over here all by yourself. Mind if we join you?" It wasn't really a question. Blackwood was already dropping into the seat across from her, Hawthorne claimed the chair to her left, and Morrison positioned himself to block her most direct route to the exit. Braxton remained standing, using his height to loom over the table in a classic intimidation pose. "So, tell us about yourself," Braxton continued, his voice pitched to carry across the hall. "What makes someone think they belong in elite training when they can barely carry their own gear?" Harlow looked up at him, her blue eyes steady and unblinking. "I'm here to learn, same as everyone else." The response was so perfectly innocent, so completely devoid of challenge or attitude, that it somehow made Braxton angrier. He'd been expecting defiance he could crush, or submission he could mock. This calm acceptance threw off his rhythm. "Learn what exactly?" Hawthorne chimed in, his demolitions background making him naturally inclined toward destruction. "How to hide in the rear with the gear while real soldiers do the fighting? How to cry when the loud noises start," Morrison added, his youth making him eager to prove himself worthy of inclusion in the group. "How to run home to mommy when things get tough," Blackwood finished, his technical expertise apparently extending to the technical art of psychological warfare. Through it all, Harlow continued eating with mechanical precision, her expression never changing, her posture never shifting. She absorbed their mockery like a stone absorbing waves, unchanged, unmoved, apparently unaffected. But Paisley Aldridge, watching from 3 tables away, recognized the stillness for what it was. She'd seen it before, in operators who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered, who understood that responding to every provocation was a luxury they couldn't afford. It was the stillness of someone who chose their battles very carefully. The harassment escalated when Braxton grew frustrated with Harlow's lack of reaction. He reached across the table and deliberately knocked over her water glass, sending liquid cascading across her meal tray. "Oops," he said with theatrical innocence. "Guess you better clean that up. Logistics is good at cleaning, right?" For just a moment, so briefly that most observers missed it entirely, something flickered across Harlow's features. Not anger, not fear, but assessment. Her eyes tracked Braxton's position, noted the location of his crew, calculated angles and distances with the automatic precision of someone who had been trained to evaluate tactical situations. Then the moment passed, and she was reaching for napkins with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything else. "No problem," she said quietly, beginning to clean up the mess. Accidents happen. The clinical calm of her response sent a chill through Morrison, though he couldn't have explained why. There was something unsettling about someone who absorbed humiliation without apparent emotion, who treated deliberate provocation as merely another problem to solve. During her medical assessment, Harlow processed trauma scenarios using advanced psychological evaluation software, originally developed for combat stress analysis. The comprehensive mental health monitoring systems featured encrypted data collection protocols and real-time cognitive assessment algorithms that enabled military psychologists to identify PTSD indicators and resilience factors in high-stress operational environments. This specialized technology, now adapted for civilian healthcare providers, revolutionized how medical professionals evaluate and treat psychological trauma in first responders and military personnel returning from deployment. The training schedule was posted at 2,100 hours, and the gathered trainees studied it with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. The program was designed to push elite soldiers beyond their comfort zones, forcing them to adapt to unfamiliar equipment, foreign tactics, and international command structures. Day 1 would begin with physical fitness assessments, followed by weapons familiarization, tactical movement exercises, and culminating in a live-fire exercise designed to establish baseline competency levels. It was the kind of schedule that would challenge even experienced special operations personnel. Harlow studied the schedule with particular attention to the weapons familiarization segment. The listed equipment included systems she'd used extensively, but in contexts that didn't appear on any official training record. Her challenge would be demonstrating competency without revealing the depth of her actual experience. As the crowd around the bulletin board dispersed, Paisley Aldridge found herself standing next to Harlow, both women studying the schedule in the artificial light of the compound's security systems. "Nervous?" Paisley asked, her tone carefully neutral. Harlow glanced at her, noting the lieutenant's bars, the airborne wings, the careful way she held herself that suggested someone comfortable with authority. "Should I be?" Most people are, their first time through something like this. Even experienced operators find NATO integration challenging. "I imagine they do." The response was professionally appropriate, but revealed nothing, which somehow revealed everything. Paisley had spent enough time around classified operations to recognize the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to protecting information. "We should get some sleep," Paisley said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As they walked toward the barracks building, Paisley noticed that Harlow moved through the compound with subtle confidence, never hesitating at intersections, never needing to check building numbers or directional signs. For someone on her first day at a new facility, she displayed remarkable familiarity with the layout. "Have you been here before?" Paisley asked. "No, ma'am." "You seem to know your way around pretty well for someone who just arrived." Harlow's stride never faltered. "I studied the compound layout during in-processing, standard preparation." It was a reasonable explanation that didn't quite explain the level of detail she demonstrated. Studying layout diagrams was one thing. Moving through unfamiliar terrain with tactical confidence was something else entirely. Back in his private quarters, Colonel Ashford was making encrypted phone calls to contacts who owed him favors. Harlow Thorne's background file was classification soup, but Ashford had been playing the military intelligence game long enough to know how to read between the redacted lines. Her medical records showed treatment for injuries consistent with IED exposure, specifically the particular pattern of soft tissue damage that came from being too close to explosions designed to kill Americans. Her psychological evaluations had been conducted by specialists who typically worked with personnel returning from extended deployments in hostile territories. Her fitness reports, the few that weren't classified, showed performance levels that suggested someone maintaining combat readiness rather than administrative competency. Most telling of all was her assignment history. The gaps were too clean, too precisely edited. Someone had gone to considerable effort to scrub her record, which meant someone with significant authority wanted her background protected. Ashford prided himself on running a clean program, but he also understood the realities of modern military operations. Sometimes the most dangerous missions required the most invisible soldiers. If Harlow Thorne was in his program, there was a reason that went far beyond logistics training. He made one more call, this one to a contact in the Pentagon who specialized in tracking classified personnel movements. The conversation was brief, conducted in the careful language of people who understood that some information couldn't be transmitted even over secure lines. When he hung up, Ashford sat in his chair for a long moment, staring at Harlow's file. In 30 years of military service, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people. His instincts were telling him that tomorrow's training exercises were going to be very interesting indeed. The barracks settled into nighttime quiet, broken only by the sounds of 200 elite soldiers settling into unfamiliar surroundings. Some talked quietly with roommates, comparing experiences and establishing the social connections that would carry them through the demanding weeks ahead. Others focused on equipment preparation, ensuring their gear would be ready for tomorrow's challenges. Harlow lay on her bunk in the darkness, listening to the sounds around her with the attention of someone for whom environmental awareness had become second nature. Warner had fallen asleep within minutes of lights out, her breathing settling into the deep rhythm of someone who'd never had reason to sleep lightly. But Harlow remained awake, her mind processing the day's information. She'd identified the key personalities, assessed the social dynamics, noted the security protocols and facility layout. More importantly, she'd established her cover identity successfully. The harmless logistics clerk who'd somehow stumbled into elite training. Tomorrow would bring the first real test. The live fire exercise would require her to demonstrate sufficient competency to avoid suspicion while carefully concealing the true extent of her capabilities. It was a delicate balance that would require all her training in deception and misdirection. She thought about the photograph hidden in her gear bag, a picture that would answer many questions if anyone found it, but also raise questions that could destroy everything she'd worked to accomplish. The image showed a younger version of herself standing next to a man whose face had been deliberately obscured, both of them wearing gear that didn't appear in any official inventory. The man's identity was classified beyond most security clearances, but his influence extended throughout the special operations community. He'd taught her things that weren't written in any manual, shown her techniques that existed only in the memories of a select few. He'd also given her the mission that brought her to this place, at this time, for reasons that remained hidden, even from most of those who'd approved her assignment. As sleep finally claimed her, Harlow's last conscious thought was of the skull tattoo hidden beneath her clothing, the mark of an organization that officially didn't exist, earned through trials that officially never happened, representing capabilities that officially belonged to someone else entirely. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of revealing just enough truth to maintain her cover, while concealing enough truth to protect her mission. It was a game she'd played before, in places where the stakes were considerably higher than military embarrassment. But as she drifted off, she allowed herself a small smile. After 3 years of careful preparation, the real mission was finally beginning. Morning came at 0500 hours, with the kind of wake-up call that separated elite soldiers from everyone else. The compound's PA system crackled to life with the voice of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, whose 20 years of military service had taught him that the most effective alarm clock was organized aggression. Rise and shine, elite warriors. You have exactly 30 minutes to be dressed, fed, and formed up in the main courtyard. Anyone who's late gets to explain their time management skills to me personally, and I promise that's not a conversation you want to have. The barracks exploded into controlled chaos as 200 of the world's most capable soldiers began their morning routines with military precision. Harlow was dressed and ready within 5 minutes, her gear arranged with the kind of systematic efficiency that came from years of practice in environments where being unprepared could be fatal. Warner, still struggling with the transition from sleep to full alertness, watched with amazement as Harlow completed her morning routine with mechanical perfection. "Holy cow," Warner muttered, fighting with her uniform buttons. "You're like a robot. How are you already ready?" "Early riser," Harlow replied, helping Warner with her equipment arrangement. "Military routine becomes habit after a while." "Yeah, but you move like someone who's been doing this for years. How long have you been in?" The question hung in the air for just a moment too long. Harlow's official service record showed 3 years of administrative positions, but her movement suggested someone with far more extensive experience. "Long enough," Harlow said finally, shouldering her pack with the kind of practiced motion that spoke of thousands of repetitions. The mess hall was organized chaos, with 200 hungry soldiers moving through the breakfast line with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Harlow selected her meal with careful attention to nutritional requirements rather than taste preferences: protein for sustained energy, complex carbohydrates for endurance, minimal processed sugars to avoid energy crashes. It was the kind of meal selection that suggested someone who understood food as fuel rather than pleasure, another small detail that separated her from soldiers whose primary concern was satisfying hunger. Braxton spotted her from across the mess hall and felt his mood improve considerably. Yesterday's entertainment had been satisfying, but today offered opportunities for more substantial harassment. The Livesya exercise would provide the perfect venue for demonstrating the gap between real soldiers and logistics pretenders. "Morning, sunshine," Braxton called out as he approached her table, his crew trailing behind like a pack of hunting dogs. "Ready for your big day? Hope you're not too attached to that perfect safety record." Harlow looked up from her meal, her expression neutral. "Good morning, Captain. I'm looking forward to the training." The polite response, delivered without any trace of sarcasm or challenge, somehow made Braxton's harassment feel clumsy and obvious. He'd been expecting fear or defiance, emotions he could exploit for entertainment. Instead, he got professional courtesy that made him look like a bully, picking on someone who refused to fight back. "Well, I hope you're a fast learner," he continued, his voice carrying enough volume to ensure nearby tables could hear. "Because today we separate the wheat from the chaff, and something tells me you're going to find yourself in the chaff pile." "I'll do my best, sir." Blackwood, sensing his captain's frustration, decided to escalate. "Your best might not be good enough, logistics. This isn't filing paperwork or ordering supplies. This is real soldier work." "I understand the distinction, Sergeant." The calm acceptance of their mockery was beginning to unnerve Morrison, who'd been expecting tears or anger, something he could understand and exploit. Instead, they were dealing with someone who absorbed their harassment like armor-absorbing bullets, apparently unaffected by their attempts at psychological warfare. If you've ever felt underestimated or witnessed someone being judged by their appearance, you know exactly how this feels. Hit that like button if you're rooting for Harlow, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will completely change everything these elite trainees think they know about strength. The morning physical fitness assessment took place on the compound's main training field, a carefully maintained expanse of grass and dirt, designed to test every aspect of military conditioning. 200 elite soldiers arranged themselves in formation, their uniforms displaying the insignia of their respective special operations units like battle flags. Harlow found herself in the rear rank, positioned among other support personnel who'd somehow earned inclusion in the elite program. The arrangement was clearly intentional, a visual reminder of the hierarchy that separated warriors from support staff. Master Sergeant Rodriguez took the elevated platform at the front of the formation, his voice carrying easily across the assembled trainees. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to NATO Elite Cross-Training. For the next 6 weeks, you will be challenged, tested, and pushed beyond whatever limits you think you have. Some of you will excel, some of you will struggle, some of you will fail completely and be sent home with your dignity intact, but your pride significantly damaged." His eyes swept across the formation, pausing momentarily on faces he'd already identified as potential problems. The first assessment is basic physical fitness: push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and a 3-mile run. These are the minimum standards for participation in advanced training. Anyone who fails any portion will be immediately recycled to basic instruction. The implications were clear. This wasn't just assessment, it was elimination. The program had no room for soldiers who couldn't meet basic physical standards, regardless of their technical specialties or administrative value. Push-ups came first, with each trainee required to complete a minimum of 80 repetitions in perfect form. Harlow positioned herself on the grass, assuming the front-leaning rest position with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything else. What the observers couldn't see was the way her muscle memory automatically adjusted her hand placement to the optimal position for maximum efficiency. Her form was textbook perfect, but more than that, it was the form of someone who'd done thousands of push-ups in conditions where failure meant consequences far worse than recycling to basic training. She completed 120 repetitions without visible strain, her breathing controlled and steady throughout the exercise. It was a performance that put her in the top 10% of the group, despite being categorized as support personnel. Rodriguez noticed. In 20 years of training soldiers, he'd developed an eye for the difference between someone who was naturally strong and someone who had been conditioned through sustained combat operations. Harlow's performance suggested the latter, not just physical fitness, but the kind of conditioning that came from carrying heavy equipment over long distances under hostile conditions. The sit-ups followed the same pattern. Harlow completed 140 repetitions with the same mechanical precision. Her core strength clearly developed through training that went far beyond standard military requirements. Pull-ups were where most support personnel struggled, the upper body strength requirements typically favoring combat specialists who spent their careers carrying heavy weapons and equipment. Harlow approached the bar with apparent uncertainty, reaching up like someone who'd never attempted the exercise. But the moment her hands closed around the metal, her body moved with practiced efficiency. She completed 35 perfect repetitions, each one executed with the controlled part that spoke of extensive training in environments where upper body strength was a survival requirement. By now, several instructors were paying attention. Rodriguez made notes on his clipboard, while exchanging glances with other senior NCOs who had noticed the discrepancy between Harlow's supposed background and her actual performance. The 3-mile run was conducted on the compound's perimeter road, a challenging course that included several hills and uneven terrain, designed to test endurance under realistic conditions. Harlow started conservatively, positioning herself in the middle of the pack, while the competitive type surged ahead in an early display of dominance. But as the run progressed, something became apparent to those watching closely. While other runners showed the normal signs of exertion, heavy breathing, visible sweat, gradually deteriorating form, Harlow maintained the same steady pace and controlled breathing from start to finish. She completed the course in 18 minutes and 42 seconds, fast enough to rank in the top 15%, but not so fast as to draw unwanted attention. It was a time that suggested someone who understood the difference between demonstrating competency and revealing capability. More importantly, she showed no signs of fatigue at the finish line. While other elite soldiers bent over their knees to catch their breath, Harlow stood calmly, her breathing barely elevated, looking like someone who could immediately begin another 3-mile run without difficulty. Paisley Aldridge, who had finished in 16th place despite her intensive training regimen, found herself studying Harlow with growing suspicion. The logistics clerk's performance was too consistent, too controlled, too indicative of someone whose physical conditioning had been developed for purposes that went far beyond administrative support. "Nice run," Paisley commented as they walked toward the equipment area for the next phase of testing. "Thank you, ma'am. You too. You don't seem winded. I try to stay in shape." It was another perfectly reasonable response that revealed nothing while somehow suggesting everything. Paisley had spent enough time around special operations personnel to recognize the careful way they discussed their capabilities, always understated, never revealing the true extent of their training or experience. The weapons familiarization exercise took place in the compound's main armory, where Master Sergeant Rodriguez had arranged a comprehensive display of NATO standard equipment. Each trainee would be required to demonstrate basic competency with rifles, pistols, and support weapons before being cleared for live-fire exercises. Harlow approached the weapons display with appropriate hesitation, reaching for an M4 carbine like someone who'd read about the system but never actually used one. Her initial grip was awkward, her stance uncertain, her overall handling suggesting someone clearly out of their depth. Rodriguez stepped closer, ready to provide basic instruction to someone who obviously needed it. "First time with an M4 specialist?" "Yes, Sergeant. I mean, I've seen them, but never actually." "No problem. Let's start with basic safety. Always treat every weapon as if it's loaded. Never point the muzzle at anything you don't intend to destroy. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire, and be sure of your target and what's beyond it. Harlow nodded attentively, playing the role of eager student receiving crucial instruction. But as Rodriguez guided her through the basic functions, charging handle, magazine release, safety selector, something began to shift in her handling. The uncertainty gradually gave way to competence, and competence gave way to what could only be described as familiarity. Her grip adjusted to the optimal position without conscious thought. Her stance shifted into perfect shooting form, and she performed a functions check with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested extensive experience. The transformation was subtle enough that casual observation might miss it entirely, but Rodriguez had been training soldiers long enough to recognize the difference between someone learning new skills and someone remembering old ones. "Where did you say you did your basic training?" Rodriguez asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Fort Jackson, Sergeant." "Uh-huh. And what was your MOS training?" 76 Yankee, supply specialist." The answers were textbook correct, matching exactly what appeared in her personnel file. But Rodriguez had trained enough supply specialists to know that their weapons familiarity typically extended to basic rifle marksmanship and not much more. What he was seeing suggested someone whose weapons training had been considerably more comprehensive. He handed her a Beretta M9 pistol, watching as she accepted it with the same initial uncertainty she'd shown with the rifle. But again, as she handled the weapon, muscle memory began to override conscious performance. Her grip found the optimal position automatically. Her finger placement on the slide and trigger guard spoke of extensive training, and she field stripped the weapon for cleaning, with movements that were too practiced to be recently learned. "Interesting technique," Rodriguez commented as Harlow reassembled the pistol with professional efficiency. "Where did you pick that up?" "Just following the manual, Sergeant." But Rodriguez had watched thousands of soldiers follow manuals, and manual-trained competency looked nothing like what he was observing. This was the kind of familiarity that came from extensive use under stress, the kind of muscle memory that developed only through sustained training in environments where weapon maintenance was a survival requirement. By the time the weapons familiarization was complete, Rodriguez had filled 3 pages of notes with observations that painted a picture increasingly inconsistent with Harlow's official background. He'd trained enough special operations personnel to recognize the signs, the specific way she checked chamber status, the particular grip modifications she unconsciously applied, the systematic approach to equipment inspection that spoke of training in advanced combat systems. Colonel Ashford observed the entire exercise from the armory's elevated observation deck. His attention focused exclusively on the logistics specialist who was demonstrating capabilities that didn't match her personnel file. His morning phone calls had yielded interesting information, not answers exactly, but confirmation that the right questions were being asked by people with appropriate security clearances. Harlow Thorne was definitely not what she appeared to be. The challenge now was determining whether she represented a security threat or a security asset, and whether her presence in his program was coincidental or part of a larger operation he wasn't cleared to know about. The live fire exercise was scheduled for 1,400 hours, giving the trainees time to clean their weapons and prepare for what would be their first real test of combat readiness. Harlow spent the interval methodically cleaning her assigned M4, her movements efficient and practiced, despite her supposed unfamiliarity with the system. Warner, struggling with her own weapon maintenance, watched with growing confusion as Harlow completed tasks that should have been challenging for someone with limited weapons experience. "You're really good at that for someone who's new to this," Warner observed, noting the systematic way Harlow broke down and reassembled the rifle components. "I'm a quick learner." "Yeah, but that's not just quick learning. That's like muscle memory, like you've done this before." Harlow paused in her cleaning routine, her hands going still for just a moment. "I guess some things come naturally." It was another non-answer that somehow felt like a confession. Warner had grown up around military equipment, and she'd never seen anyone develop that level of familiarity with complex systems through natural aptitude alone. But before she could pursue the question further, Master Sergeant Rodriguez's voice echoed through the armory. "All right, warriors, time to find out who can actually shoot and who's been wasting the government's ammunition all these years. Live fire exercise commences in 15 minutes. Anyone who's not ready gets to explain their time management skills to me personally." The live fire range was a sophisticated facility designed to test marksmanship under realistic conditions. electronic targets at various distances, computer-controlled scoring systems, and environmental factors designed to simulate combat stress. It was the kind of range that separated recreational shooters from combat marksmen. Harlow approached her assigned firing position with the same apparent uncertainty she'd shown throughout the weapon's familiarization. Her stance looked awkward, her grip uncertain, her overall demeanor suggesting someone clearly out of her depth. The exercise began with basic marksmanship at 50 meters. Each trainee required to place 5 rounds within the target's scoring rings. Most of the elite soldiers performed well, their shots grouping tightly in the high-scoring zones with the consistency expected from special operations personnel. Harlow's first shot went wide, missing the target entirely and striking the earthen backstop with a dull thud. Laughter rippled through the nearby firing positions as Braxton's voice carried across the range. "Looks like logistics needs some basic lessons. Maybe try holding it by the right end." Her second shot was closer, but still outside the scoring rings, drawing more mockery from the elite trainees who were clustering their rounds in the target's center mass. Harlow appeared to be struggling with basic concepts like sight alignment and trigger control. But Rodriguez, observing from the range tower, noticed something others missed. Harlow's wild shots weren't actually wild. They were consistently striking specific points on the target framework, suggesting someone who was hitting exactly where she was aiming, just not where others expected her to aim. Her third shot struck the target's outer ring, a marginal improvement that suggested gradual learning. Her fourth shot moved closer to center, and her fifth shot struck the scoring zone with respectable accuracy. It was exactly the kind of progression someone might expect from a support specialist receiving her first serious marksmanship training. Slow initial learning, followed by rapid improvement as basic concepts clicked into place. But Rodriguez had been observing closely enough to notice the subtle adjustments Harlow made between shots. Not the fumbling corrections of someone learning new skills, but the methodical fine-tuning of someone calibrating equipment to environmental conditions. The exercise progressed to longer ranges, 100 meters, then 200, with increasingly challenging conditions designed to test advanced marksmanship skills. Most support personnel struggled at these distances, their shots scattering as wind and range estimation challenges exceeded their training. Harlow continued her pattern of apparent gradual improvement, her shots slowly tightening into respectable groups, while never quite achieving the precision demonstrated by the elite combat specialists. It was a performance that suggested competence without excellence, progress without mastery. But Paisley Aldridge, shooting from the adjacent firing point, was beginning to notice inconsistencies in Harlow's technique. The way she read wind conditions was too sophisticated for someone supposedly learning basic marksmanship. Her breathing pattern during shooting was too controlled, too indicative of extensive training in precision shooting techniques. Most tellingly, her adjustment methods between shots suggested someone who understood advanced ballistics, not just the basic concepts taught in standard marksmanship training, but the subtle calculations that separated amateur shooters from professional marksmen. The final phase of the exercise required each trainee to engage multiple targets at varying distances under time pressure, simulating the kind of rapid target acquisition necessary in combat situations. It was a challenging evolution that tested not just marksmanship but decision-making under stress. Harlow approached the evolution with apparent nervousness, her movements hesitant as she waited for the range command to begin engaging targets. When the signal came, she started slowly, taking careful aim at each target, while other shooters moved through the sequence with practiced efficiency. But as the exercise progressed, something shifted in her performance. Her movements became more fluid, her target transitions smoother, her shooting rhythm more consistent. By the end of the sequence, she was engaging targets with a precision that bordered on mechanical, not the improvised accuracy of someone learning under pressure, but the systematic precision of someone whose training had made such exercises routine. Her final score placed her in the upper third of all participants, respectable for support personnel, but not outstanding enough to draw unwanted attention. It was exactly the kind of performance that would satisfy requirements without raising questions about her actual capabilities. Rodriguez completed his scoring notes with growing certainty that Harlow Thorne was considerably more than she appeared to be. Her performance pattern, initial struggle followed by steady improvement culminating in above-average competency, was too perfectly choreographed to be genuine learning. Real novices didn't develop advanced shooting techniques through 15 minutes of range time. Real support specialists didn't demonstrate the kind of environmental awareness and ballistic calculation skills he'd observed. Real logistics clerks didn't move through complex firing sequences with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested extensive training in advanced marksmanship. As the trainees began cleaning their weapons and securing their equipment, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He was going to conduct some research into Specialist Harlow Thorne's background, using resources that went considerably beyond her official personnel file. Because in 20 years of training elite soldiers, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people, and his instincts were telling him that tomorrow's training exercises were going to be very interesting indeed. The evening debriefing took place in the compound's main briefing room, where Colonel Ashford addressed the assembled trainees with the kind of measured authority that came from 3 decades of military leadership. The day's performance had been evaluated, scores recorded, and initial assessments made about each participant's potential for successful program completion. Today's exercises were designed to establish baseline competency levels, Ashford announced, his voice carrying easily through the assembled group. Most of you performed within expected parameters for elite military personnel. Some exceeded expectations. A few fell short of minimum standards. His eyes swept across the assembled trainees, pausing briefly on faces he'd already identified as requiring additional attention. Tomorrow, we begin tactical movement exercises, followed by combat simulations and specialized weapons training. The pace will accelerate, the challenges will intensify, and the margin for error will decrease significantly. Harlow listened from her position in the rear of the briefing room, her expression attentive but unremarkable. To casual observation, she appeared to be absorbing information like any other trainee preparing for challenging exercises. But Paisley Aldridge, seated 3 rows ahead, noticed the way Harlow's eyes moved during the briefing. Not the random scanning of someone struggling to follow complex information, but the systematic assessment of someone cataloging details for future reference. When Ashford displayed the next day's training schedule, Harlow's attention sharpened in ways that suggested familiarity with the exercises being described. Her body language indicated not apprehension about unknown challenges, but preparation for tests she understood all too well. Harlow's specialized insurance coverage included comprehensive disability and life insurance policies designed specifically for classified military operations personnel. The exclusive financial protection packages featured enhanced coverage limits and specialized provisions for combat-related injuries that standard insurance policies couldn't accommodate. These premium insurance products, originally available only to elite special operations units, provided complete financial security for families of personnel engaged in high-risk classified missions, where traditional coverage was insufficient or completely unavailable. As the briefing concluded and trainees began filing out toward their evening meal, Colonel Ashford made a subtle gesture toward Master Sergeant Rodriguez. The 2 men had worked together long enough to communicate through minimal signals, and Rodriguez understood that a private conversation was required. They met in Ashford's office 15 minutes later, the door secured and the conversation conducted in the careful language of people who understood that some information couldn't be discussed even in supposedly secure environments. "Your assessment?" Ashford asked without preamble. Rodriguez consulted his notes, though both men knew the real evaluation was based on observations that couldn't be quantified through scoring systems. "She's not what her file says she is." Elaborate. "Weapons handling suggests extensive training beyond basic military requirements. Physical conditioning is consistent with sustained combat operations. Tactical awareness indicates someone who's spent time in environments where situational awareness was a survival requirement." Ashford nodded, his expression confirming that Rodriguez's observations aligned with his own assessment. "Background verification? Limited success. Most of her training history is classified above my clearance level, which is unusual for support personnel. Medical records indicate treatment for injuries consistent with combat exposure, but the specifics are redacted. Recommendations?" Rodriguez paused, choosing his words carefully. "Close observation during tomorrow's exercises. If she's what I think she is, the tactical movement evolutions will be more revealing than basic marksmanship. And if she's not what we think she is, then we've got a logistics clerk who's wasting everyone's time in a program designed for elite operators." But both men knew which scenario was more likely. In 30 years of combined military experience, they'd learned to recognize the signs of soldiers whose official assignments didn't match their actual capabilities. The question now was whether Harlow Thorne's presence represented a security concern or a security asset, and whether her mission, whatever it might be, aligned with the program's objectives or threatened them. As Rodriguez left the office, Ashford made another encrypted phone call to contacts who might provide additional insight into Specialist Thorne's background. The conversation was brief and conducted in the careful euphemisms of people who understood that some information couldn't be transmitted even over supposedly secure lines. When he hung up, Ashford sat in his chair for a long moment, studying the file that contained too many questions and not enough answers. Tomorrow's training would provide opportunities for more detailed observation, chances to assess whether Harlow Thorne's capabilities matched the growing suspicions about her true background. Because in 30 years of military service, he'd learned that the most dangerous threats often came disguised as the most innocuous assets. And something about the logistics specialist with the perfect innocent demeanor was triggering every instinct he had developed for identifying problems before they became crises. Back in the barracks, Harlow completed her evening routine with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything else. Equipment cleaned and arranged, uniform prepared for the next day, personal items secured in their designated locations. Warner, observing from her own bunk, continued to notice details that didn't quite align with someone whose military experience had been limited to administrative positions. The way Harlow secured her gear suggested someone accustomed to environments where equipment theft or tampering was a constant concern. Her personal hygiene routine was economical and efficient, the kind of abbreviated self-care that developed during extended field operations, where time and resources were limited. Most tellingly, her sleep preparation included subtle security measures, positioning herself to maintain awareness of the room's entrances, arranging her gear to serve as early warning system for unauthorized intrusion, keeping essential items within immediate reach, despite regulations requiring personal equipment to be properly stowed. "You're really careful about your stuff," Warner observed, as Harlow completed her final equipment check. "Military equipment is expensive. I'd rather not explain to some sergeant why I lost government property." It was another reasonable explanation that didn't quite explain the level of security consciousness she demonstrated. Warner had served long enough to recognize the difference between someone who was careful with equipment and someone who had been trained to treat security as a survival requirement. But before she could pursue the question further, the barracks lights dimmed to their nighttime setting, and conversation became impossible without disturbing the sleep preparation of 200 elite soldiers who would need every minute of rest they could get. Harlow lay in her bunk, listening to the sounds of the compound settling into its nighttime routine. Security patrols moving through their designated routes, equipment cooling in the evening air, the distant hum of generators maintaining the facility's power grid. To most observers, she appeared to fall asleep within minutes of lights out, her breathing settling into the deep rhythm of someone who would learn to take rest whenever it was available. But her mind remained active, processing the day's information and preparing for tomorrow's challenges. The tactical movement exercises would require more careful performance management than basic marksmanship. Movement techniques revealed training backgrounds in ways that shooting scores could not, and she would need to demonstrate improvement without revealing the extent of her actual experience. More challenging still would be maintaining her cover identity, while working alongside soldiers whose own training might enable them to recognize advanced techniques when they saw them. Paisley Aldridge was already asking pointed questions, and Master Sergeant Rodriguez was clearly suspicious about discrepancies between her supposed background and actual performance. The mission required her to remain invisible until the right moment, to gather information while appearing to be exactly what her cover identity suggested. But invisibility was becoming increasingly difficult as each exercise revealed capabilities that didn't match her official assignment. She thought again about the photograph hidden in her gear bag, the image that would answer many questions while raising others that could compromise everything she'd worked to accomplish. The man in the picture had taught her that the most effective weapons were often the most invisible ones, that the greatest victories were achieved by enemies who never saw the threat until it was too late. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for observation. The tactical movement exercises would reveal how elite soldiers moved through hostile terrain, what techniques they favored, what weaknesses they displayed under stress. But more importantly, tomorrow would bring her closer to identifying the real target of her mission, the security leak that had compromised multiple NATO operations and cost the lives of soldiers whose deaths had been attributed to bad luck rather than betrayal. Someone in this program was selling information to hostile forces. Someone with access to classified operational details was trading American lives for foreign money. Someone who thought they were safe behind their elite credentials and impeccable service records was about to discover that some hunters were patient enough to spend months establishing the perfect position for a single, decisive shot. As sleep finally claimed her, Harlow's last conscious thought was of the mission that had brought her to this place, at this time, wearing the disguise of someone too harmless to be worth watching closely. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. This is the moment everything changes. If you're as shocked as I am by these revelations, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to see that heroes don't always look the part. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. Day 2 began with tactical movement exercises designed to test how elite soldiers navigated hostile terrain under combat conditions. The morning air carried the sharp scent of gunpowder from the previous day's live-fire exercises, mixing with the Virginia humidity to create an atmosphere that felt charged with potential violence. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had constructed a complex obstacle course that simulated urban combat environments. Concrete barriers, razor wire, simulated building structures, and electronic sensors designed to detect movement patterns and tactical decision-making under stress. Harlow approached the course with her characteristic combination of apparent uncertainty and subtle competence. Her initial movements looked hesitant, like someone unfamiliar with advanced tactical techniques, but observers watching closely might have noticed the way she automatically assessed cover positions and identified potential fields of fire. The exercise required teams of 4 to move through the course while maintaining communication and mutual support. Harlow found herself assigned to a mixed unit that included Braxton, Morrison, and a German KSK operator named Klaus Weber, who spoke English with precise military terminology that suggested extensive international training. "Try to keep up, logistics," Braxton announced as they prepared to enter the course. "This isn't walking through supply warehouses. This is real soldier movement." But as the exercise began, something remarkable happened. Harlow's movements through the obstacle course were not just competent, they were textbook perfect. She used cover and concealment with the systematic precision of someone who had been trained in environments where exposure meant death. Her communication was crisp and professional, using proper tactical terminology with the fluency that came only from extensive field experience. Most significantly, she began to anticipate threats and identify optimal routes through complex terrain before other team members recognized the same opportunities. It was the kind of tactical awareness that separated amateur soldiers from combat veterans. Weber, whose own training had been extensive enough to recognize advanced techniques when he saw them, found himself studying Harlow with growing puzzlement. Her movement patterns suggested someone whose training had included urban warfare, close-quarters combat, and small unit tactics, not the kind of skills typically associated with logistics support. The course culminated in a simulated hostage rescue scenario where teams had to clear a building while protecting civilian targets and neutralizing hostile forces. It was the kind of complex evolution that challenged even experienced special operations personnel. Harlow took point position without being assigned, moving through the structure with the kind of systematic precision that spoke of extensive training in close-quarters combat. Her room-clearing techniques were flawless, her target identification instantaneous, her movement through confined spaces economical and efficient. By the time the exercise concluded, Weber was convinced that he was working alongside someone whose actual training background was significantly more extensive than her supposed logistics specialty would suggest. "Where did you learn to move like that?" Weber asked, as they completed the after-action debrief. "Basic training covers movement techniques," Harlow replied, her tone suggesting the conversation was closed. But Weber had trained with enough special operations personnel from various nations to recognize the difference between basic movement training and advanced tactical instruction. What he'd observed suggested someone whose education had included the kind of specialized techniques that were typically reserved for elite combat units. Rodriguez, observing from the control tower, filled additional pages of notes with observations that continued to paint a picture increasingly inconsistent with Harlow's official background. Her performance during the tactical movement exercises had been virtually flawless, not the gradual improvement pattern she had demonstrated during weapons training, but the consistent excellence of someone for whom such exercises were routine. The live fire exercise that afternoon would provide the most revealing test yet. Unlike the previous day's basic marksmanship, today's evolution would require rapid target engagement under stress, simulating the kind of combat conditions that separated recreational shooters from combat marksmen. The range had been configured with multiple target arrays at varying distances, some stationary, others moving on mechanical systems designed to simulate hostile forces. Electronic scoring systems would track not just accuracy, but response times, target prioritization, and tactical decision-making under pressure. Harlow approached her assigned firing position with the same apparent nervousness she'd shown throughout her time at the facility. Her initial stance looked uncertain, her grip on the rifle seemed hesitant, her overall demeanor suggested someone clearly intimidated by the complexity of the exercise. "Remember, logistics," Braxton called out from the adjacent firing position. "Try not to shoot any friendlies. That paperwork is really complicated." The exercise began with a command to engage multiple targets in sequence, each representing different threat levels and requiring different tactical responses. Most elite soldiers moved through the sequence with practiced efficiency, their shots clustering in the high-scoring zones with the consistency expected from special operations personnel. Harlow's performance started slowly, her initial shots missing targets entirely as she struggled with what appeared to be basic concepts like sight alignment and trigger control. Laughter rippled through the nearby firing positions as her apparent incompetence became entertainment for the elite trainees. But Rodriguez, watching through high-powered optics from the range tower, noticed something others missed. Harlow's wild shots weren't actually wild. They were precisely placed impacts on specific points of the target framework, suggesting someone who was hitting exactly where she intended to aim. As the exercise progressed, her performance appeared to improve dramatically. Her target engagement became more accurate, her response times faster, her tactical decision-making more sophisticated. By the final phase of the exercise, she was engaging multiple targets with rapid precision that bordered on mechanical efficiency. But what really caught Rodriguez's attention was a casual comment she made while adjusting her rifle between target arrays. "Sight picture's running about 2 mils high at this range," she murmured, apparently to herself. "Probably atmospheric pressure differential from yesterday's readings." The comment revealed knowledge that went far beyond basic marksmanship training. Understanding mil-dot calculations and atmospheric effects on ballistics required advanced instruction in precision shooting techniques, the kind of education typically reserved for designated marksmen and sniper-qualified personnel. More revealing still was her casual reference to yesterday's readings, suggesting access to meteorological data that wasn't provided to standard participants in basic live-fire exercises. Rodriguez made additional notes, his suspicions about Harlow's true background crystallizing into near certainty. In 20 years of training soldiers, he'd never seen anyone develop advanced ballistic calculation skills through 15 minutes of range time. The afternoon concluded with equipment maintenance, during which Harlow demonstrated the same pattern of apparent learning, followed by suspicious competence. Her weapon cleaning techniques were too systematic, her equipment inspection too thorough, her overall approach too professional for someone supposedly new to advanced military systems. As the day's training concluded, and trainees began preparing for evening chow, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He was going to conduct a detailed background investigation into Specialist Harlow Thorne, using resources that went considerably beyond standard personnel verification procedures. Colonel Ashford received Rodriguez's preliminary report during the evening briefing, reviewing the observations with the kind of careful attention he reserved for potential security concerns. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear. Harlow Thorne was considerably more than she appeared to be, and her presence in the program was almost certainly related to objectives that went beyond logistics training. The question now was whether to confront her directly or continue observation until her true purpose became apparent. Ashford's 3 decades of military experience suggested that patience would yield more information than confrontation, but the security implications of an unidentified operative in his program were becoming impossible to ignore. The next morning brought the most challenging evolution yet, a simulated terrorist attack designed to test how elite soldiers responded to unexpected threats under extreme stress. The exercise had been planned for months, with elaborate scenarios involving multiple hostile forces, civilian casualties, and complex tactical requirements. What nobody anticipated was that the simulation would become terrifyingly real. The exercise began at 0800 hours, with trainees positioned throughout the compound, each assigned specific roles in responding to a coordinated terrorist assault on the facility. Electronic systems simulated explosions, weapon fire, and communication disruptions, while actors playing hostile forces created realistic threat scenarios. Harlow had been assigned to the logistics support element, responsible for maintaining communication links and coordinating supply requirements during the simulated crisis. It was exactly the kind of rear echelon assignment that matched her supposed specialty while keeping her away from the more complex tactical evolutions. But at 0847 hours, something went catastrophically wrong. A real explosion erupted from the compound's eastern perimeter, the shockwave shattering windows and sending debris cascading across the training areas. The blast was followed immediately by secondary explosions as fuel storage tanks ignited, creating a wall of flame and smoke that blocked visibility across half the facility. The simulation became reality in an instant, with 200 elite soldiers suddenly facing an actual emergency that threatened their lives and the security of a classified NATO installation. In the chaos that followed, most personnel followed their training, taking cover, establishing communication, beginning damage assessment procedures. But Harlow's response was different entirely. She moved toward the explosion rather than away from it, her movements quick and purposeful as she assessed the tactical situation with the automatic precision of someone who'd responded to similar crises before. Her demeanor shifted completely, the apparent uncertainty vanishing, as she took charge of a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Secondary explosions incoming," she shouted, her voice carrying across the compound with authority that made trained soldiers stop and listen. "Omega Protocol evacuation, eastern sectors clear immediately." The command was specific, professional, and revealed knowledge that should have been impossible for someone with her supposed clearance level. Omega Protocol was a classified evacuation procedure known only to personnel with access to the facility's highest security information. But more shocking still was the way other soldiers responded to her commands. Elite special operations personnel who'd been dismissing her as logistics support suddenly found themselves following her directions without question, their training recognizing the voice of someone who understood crisis management at the highest levels. Rodriguez, emerging from a damaged building, with blood running down his face from flying glass, spotted Harlow directing evacuation procedures with tactical hand signals he'd never seen before. The signals were too complex, too sophisticated for standard military communication. They suggested training in specialized operational protocols that didn't exist in any unclassified manual. "Where did you learn those signals?" he demanded as she guided a group of injured trainees toward the medical station. Harlow glanced at him, her blue eyes now carrying an intensity that made him step back involuntarily. "I wrote them." The simple statement hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. Signal development was conducted by military intelligence specialists with decades of experience and security clearances that went far beyond anything a logistics clerk should possess. But before he could pursue the question further, another series of explosions erupted from the compound's southern section. The crisis was escalating beyond the capacity of normal response procedures, and decisions needed to be made by someone with authority to override standard protocols. Harlow grabbed the emergency radio from Rodriguez's equipment vest, adjusting the frequency with the automatic precision of someone who had used similar systems extensively. Her transmission was crisp, professional, and revealed access to communication networks that were supposed to be restricted to senior command personnel. "Falcon Base, this is Reaper 7. Declare emergency protocols, initiate lockdown procedures, civilian evacuation authorized under Article 7 provisions." The response came immediately, the radio operator's voice carrying recognition and authority. "Reaper 7, confirmed. Emergency protocols active, lockdown initiated, medical support en route." Rodriguez stared at the radio in shock. The call sign Reaper 7 wasn't in any database he had access to, but the immediate response from Falcon Base suggested someone with credentials that went far beyond logistics support. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the continuing explosions. Harlow handed him back the radio, her expression returning to its characteristic neutrality. "Someone who's tired of pretending to be harmless." The rescue operation that followed revealed capabilities that transformed everyone's understanding of who Harlow Thorne really was. She moved through the crisis with systematic efficiency, coordinating evacuation procedures, directing medical support, and managing tactical responses with the kind of comprehensive expertise that suggested extensive training in crisis management. More significantly, she demonstrated knowledge of the facility's classified systems that should have been impossible for someone with her supposed security clearance. She knew the locations of emergency exits that weren't marked on standard facility maps, understood communication protocols that weren't taught in basic training, and possessed access codes for systems that were supposed to be restricted to senior command personnel. By the time professional rescue teams arrived, the crisis had been largely contained through procedures that Harlow had implemented with the support of soldiers who'd begun following her commands without question. Colonel Ashford arrived via emergency helicopter, his face grim as he surveyed the damage to his facility. But his expression changed completely when he spotted Harlow coordinating final evacuation procedures with the calm efficiency of someone for whom such crises were routine. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Ashford called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of command authority. "I need a complete briefing on response procedures. Who initiated Omega protocols?" Rodriguez pointed toward Harlow, who was completing final headcount procedures with systematic precision. "She did, sir. Specialist Thorne. She knew classified evacuation procedures, had access to restricted communication networks, and coordinated response operations, like someone with extensive crisis management training." Ashford studied Harlow with the calculating gaze of someone whose 30 years of military experience had taught him to recognize anomalies before they became problems. "Bring her to me." But as Rodriguez approached Harlow to relay the colonel's command, another figure emerged from the emergency response vehicles. A young officer in pristine uniform, his insignia indicating recent promotion to lieutenant, his demeanor suggesting someone eager to establish authority in a crisis situation. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had arrived with the rescue teams, his assignment unclear, but his attitude unmistakable. He surveyed the scene with the arrogance of someone who'd never personally experienced the kind of crisis he was now observing, his clean uniform and nervous energy marking him as someone whose expertise was theoretical rather than practical. "Who's in charge of this mess?" Webb demanded, his voice pitched to carry across the compound. "This facility is supposed to be secure. How did this happen?" Harlow turned toward him, her expression carefully neutral. "Emergency protocols were followed, sir. Casualties minimized, facility secured." Webb stepped closer, using his height to loom over her in a classic intimidation pose. "I wasn't talking to you, specialist. This is a command-level incident requiring senior officer oversight." "Yes, sir." But something in Harlow's calm acceptance seemed to infuriate Webb rather than satisfy him. He'd been expecting deference that recognized his authority, submission that acknowledged his superior rank and position. Instead, he got professional courtesy that somehow felt like condescension. "What's your role in this incident?" Webb continued, his voice growing sharper. "Logistics personnel shouldn't have been involved in emergency response procedures. I assisted with evacuation coordination, sir." "Assisted?" Webb's laugh was harsh and mocking. "From what I heard, you were giving orders like some kind of commander? That's not your job, specialist. That's not your place." The confrontation was drawing attention from other personnel, including several senior NCOs who'd witnessed Harlow's performance during the crisis. Their expressions suggested growing discomfort with Webb's handling of someone who'd just demonstrated exceptional competence under extreme stress. But Webb was committed to his course of action, his inexperience making him mistake professional competence for insubordination. "You think because you helped during an emergency, that makes you some kind of hero? Your logistics support, nothing more. Your job is to follow orders, not give them." Harlow's response was perfectly correct, professionally appropriate, and somehow more unsettling than any challenge could have been. "I understand my role, sir." "Do you? Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been playing soldier when you should have been staying in your lane." The insult hung in the air like smoke from the still-burning fuel tanks. Every person within earshot understood that Webb had just crossed a line, challenging not just Harlow's competence, but her right to be considered a real soldier. Rodriguez stepped forward, his 20 years of experience recognizing a situation that was about to escalate beyond anyone's control. "Lieutenant, maybe we should focus on post-incident procedures rather than personnel assignments." But Webb was too committed to his confrontation to accept graceful withdrawal. "No, Sergeant. This is exactly the kind of attitude problem that needs to be addressed immediately. Specialist Thorne here seems to think she's qualified for roles beyond her training and experience." He moved closer to Harlow, his voice dropping to a level that was technically professional but carried unmistakable threat. Let me make something very clear. You are not special. You are not important. You are a logistics clerk who got lucky during an emergency, and that doesn't change anything about who you really are. The investigation that followed required specialized legal consultation services with expertise in military law and classified operations protocols. These exclusive legal firms provided comprehensive representation for personnel involved in sensitive military matters, offering expert navigation of complex security clearance issues and classified information handling. The specialized legal education programs trained attorneys in the unique challenges of military justice, operational security, and the intersection of civilian and military law in high-stakes national security cases. Webb reached out and grabbed the front of Harlow's gray t-shirt, his intention unclear but his aggression unmistakable. You're nothing but a fake playing at being something important. The fabric of her shirt was old and worn, weakened by repeated washing and field use. When Webb yanked it forward with violent force, the material couldn't withstand the stress. The shirt tore completely, the gray fabric ripping from collar to hem and exposing her back and shoulder to the assembled crowd. For exactly 3 seconds, the entire compound went silent. The tattoo was a masterwork of black ink that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Dominating her shoulder blade was a human skull rendered in intricate detail, but this wasn't the simple death's head common to military units. This skull wore a crown, an ornate piece of royal regalia with detailed gems and precious metals that spoke of hours under the needle by an artist who understood the significance of every line. Below the crowned skull, in letters that looked like they'd been carved rather than tattooed, were the characters RQ-11. The silence stretched beyond comprehension, as everyone present processed what they were seeing. This wasn't just body art. This was a mark that carried meaning in circles, where meaning could be deadly. The first sound to break the silence was a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd. Then another, then the metallic crackle of radio equipment as someone's hand instinctively reached for their communication device. "Holy cow," someone whispered, the words barely audible but carrying across the compound like thunder. Webb's grip on the torn fabric went slack, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching terror. Because even he, despite his inexperience and arrogance, had heard the stories about RQ designations. They were legends whispered in military circles, tales of operators who didn't officially exist but whose influence shaped conflicts around the world. Rodriguez dropped his clipboard, the sound of metal hitting concrete echoing like a gunshot. In 20 years of military service, he had met exactly 3 people who carried RQ designations. All of them had been the kind of soldiers whose real names appeared in files so classified that confirming their existence required presidential authorization. But it was Paisley Aldridge's reaction that confirmed what everyone was beginning to suspect. She snapped to attention with military precision that was purely involuntary, her body recognizing the significance of the markings before her mind could process the implications. "Reaper Queen," she whispered, the words carrying a reverence that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. Colonel Ashford, observing from 50 meters away, felt his 30 years of military experience crystallize into a single moment of absolute clarity. He'd been expecting to debrief a logistics specialist about emergency response procedures. Instead, he was looking at a tattoo that represented the highest levels of classified military operations. The radio equipment in his aide's hands crackled to life with an incoming transmission that carried the static patterns of heavily encrypted communication. "Falcon Base, this is Apex Command. Confirm Reaper Queen protocol authentication. Immediate response required." Ashford took the handset with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Apex Command, this is Falcon Base Actual. Authentication confirmed. RQ-11 designation verified visual confirmation." The response came immediately, the voice carrying authority that made even a full colonel straighten unconsciously. "Falcon Base, lock down all personnel. Scramble security teams. Classified briefing authorized for facility commander only. ETA 12 minutes. As the transmission ended, Ashford looked across the compound at Harlow, who was standing perfectly still, despite her torn clothing, and the hundreds of eyes focused on her exposed tattoo. Her expression hadn't changed. Not embarrassment, not defiance, just the same calm professionalism she'd displayed throughout her time at the facility. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Ashford called out, his voice carrying enough authority to cut through the stunned silence. "Secure the area. Nobody moves until further notice." But Rodriguez was staring at Harlow with an expression that combined awe, respect, and something approaching fear. Because in 20 years of training elite soldiers, he had finally met someone whose training had been so far beyond his own experience that comparison was meaningless. Webb, still holding the torn fabric, seemed incapable of movement or speech. His earlier arrogance had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that he'd just physically assaulted someone whose actual rank and authority were classified beyond his comprehension. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, military aircraft arriving with the kind of rapid response that suggested pre-positioned assets rather than emergency deployment. These weren't rescue helicopters. They were command and control aircraft carrying personnel whose security clearances gave them a thorough authority over situations that most officers would never encounter. Harlow finally moved, reaching down to pull the torn remnants of her shirt back into some semblance of coverage. The motion was casual, unhurried, like someone adjusting clothing after minor inconvenience, rather than someone whose deepest secrets had just been exposed to hundreds of witnesses. "Well," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent compound with perfect clarity, "I suppose that changes things." The understatement was so profound that several people actually laughed. Nervous, disbelieving sounds that reflected the complete disconnect between the calm observation and the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Rodriguez found his voice first. "Ma'am, we didn't know. Your file, your assignment, everything suggested." "That was the point, Sergeant." The simple acknowledgement confirmed what everyone was beginning to understand. Harlow Thorne's presence at the NATO facility hadn't been coincidental. Her assignment to logistics support hadn't been administrative error. Her apparent incompetence hadn't been genuine inexperience. She'd been playing a role, maintaining cover so perfect that even experienced military personnel had been completely deceived until circumstances forced revelation of her true identity. The complete transformation of respect you just witnessed proves that assumptions can be deadly. Like if this story gave you chills, subscribe for more Hidden Warrior stories, and check out the video appearing on your screen now about another underestimated hero who changed everything. The helicopters touched down in precise formation, their rotor wash creating dust clouds that obscured vision but couldn't mask the unmistakable sound of military efficiency in action. The aircraft weren't standard transport helicopters. They were command variants equipped with advanced communication systems and carrying personnel whose presence suggested this situation had implications far beyond a simple training accident. The first person to emerge was a man in his 50s, wearing civilian clothes that somehow screamed military authority. His bearing was unmistakable, the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room, the careful awareness of someone whose survival had depended on constant vigilance. Behind him came a team of personnel whose insignia and equipment marked them as belonging to organizations that didn't appear on standard military charts. Their movements were coordinated, professional, and carried the kind of lethal competence that made experienced soldiers step back instinctively. But it was the final figure to emerge from the lead helicopter that made everyone present understand the true significance of what had just occurred. SEAL Commander Riker Beckham was a legend in special operations circles, a man whose career had spanned 3 decades of classified missions and whose influence shaped policy at the highest levels of military command. His presence at a NATO training facility could only mean that the situation had escalated far beyond normal security concerns. Beckham approached the group with measured steps, his eyes scanning the assembled personnel before focusing on Harlow with an intensity that seemed to make the air itself grow heavier. "Reaper Queen," he said, his voice carrying enough authority to make everyone present snap to attention involuntarily. "It's been a long time." Harlow's response was simple, direct, and somehow more revealing than any elaborate explanation could have been. "Hello, Riker. Sorry about the cover." The casual use of the commander's first name confirmed what the assembled personnel were beginning to suspect. This wasn't a chance encounter between superior and subordinate. This was a reunion between professionals whose working relationship operated at levels far beyond normal military hierarchy. "How long have you been here?" Beckham asked, his tone suggesting a conversation between equals rather than a military briefing. 3 months, long enough to confirm what we suspected." Beckham nodded, his expression indicating that her answer had confirmed rather than surprised him. The leak? Identified and documented. Full evidence package ready for transmission. The exchange was conducted in the careful language of people accustomed to discussing classified operations in potentially insecure environments. But everyone present understood they were witnessing the conclusion of something that had been months in preparation. Colonel Ashford approached slowly, his 30 years of military experience providing just enough background to recognize that he was observing something far beyond his normal authority. "Commander Beckham," he said formally, "I need to understand what's happening at my facility." Beckham turned toward him, and Ashford felt the full weight of attention from someone whose career had been built on making life-or-death decisions under impossible circumstances. "Colonel, what's happening is the conclusion of a counterintelligence operation that's been 18 months in development. Specialist Thorne, or rather Major Mitchell, has been operating under deep cover to identify security leaks that have compromised multiple NATO operations." The revelation hit the assembled personnel like a physical blow. Major, not specialist, not logistic support, but a field-grade officer whose actual rank put her among the senior leadership of whatever organization had authorized her mission. "Major," Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly as he processed the implications. "She outranks half the people in this program." "She outranks all of them," Beckham corrected. "Her actual position is classified beyond your clearance level, but I can tell you that she has direct authority over operations you'll never be briefed about." Webb, still holding the torn fabric of Harlow's shirt, seemed to have lost the ability to speak or move. The magnitude of his error was becoming clear. He'd just physically assaulted a senior officer conducting a classified operation under direct command authority that went to the highest levels of military intelligence. But Harlow, Major Mitchell, seemed more concerned with completing her mission than pursuing retribution for Webb's behavior. "The corruption network extends deeper than initial intelligence suggested," she reported to Beckham, her tone shifting to the professional efficiency of someone delivering critical operational information. "Multiple officers compromised, financial connections to hostile intelligence services confirmed, operational security violations documented." She produced a small device from her remaining clothing, a military-grade data storage unit that had somehow survived the physical confrontation and equipment failures of the morning's crisis. "Complete evidence package," she continued, handing the device to Beckham. "Financial records, communication intercepts, operational timelines, everything needed for prosecution and network dismantlement." Beckham accepted the device with the gravity appropriate to information that had been purchased with months of dangerous undercover work. Casualties? None directly attributable to the leak, but several operations were compromised early enough to require mission adjustments. Without intervention, estimated casualty projections were significant. The clinical language couldn't mask the reality that Harlow's mission had potentially saved dozens of lives by identifying security vulnerabilities before they could be exploited by hostile forces. Colonel Ashford, processing the implications of what he'd just learned, felt his understanding of the past 3 months shift completely. Every anomaly in Harlow's behavior, every inconsistency in her performance, every moment when her capabilities had seemed inconsistent with her supposed background, all of it suddenly made perfect sense as the actions of a highly trained operative maintaining cover while conducting surveillance. "Who's compromised?" he asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the scope of the security failure. Harlow's expression darkened as she prepared to deliver information that would destroy careers and potentially send people to military prison for the rest of their lives. "Colonel Marcus Ashford," she said quietly, "you're under arrest for treason, espionage, and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism against United States military personnel." The words hit like lightning, stunning everyone present into absolute silence. Ashford himself seemed unable to process what he'd just heard, his face cycling through disbelief, denial, and growing comprehension as the implications became clear. "That's impossible," he managed finally, his voice barely audible. "I've served my country for 30 years. My record is spotless. My security clearances are current." "Your financial records show deposits totaling $2.7 million from sources connected to foreign intelligence services," Harlow replied with clinical precision. "Your communication history includes encrypted transmissions to individuals known to be hostile assets. Your access to NATO operational planning provided information that directly resulted in the compromise of 4 separate special operations missions. The evidence was delivered with the kind of systematic completeness that spoke of months of careful investigation. This wasn't suspicion or theory. This was documented proof of betrayal at the highest levels. Security personnel from Beckham's team moved forward with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated and professional as they prepared to take Ashford into custody. The colonel didn't resist, his 30 years of military training recognizing the inevitability of what was happening. But as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, he looked at Harlow with an expression that combined hatred, respect, and something approaching admiration. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since the 2nd week. Your operational security was adequate but not perfect. Small mistakes, but enough to establish pattern confirmation. And you've been watching me for 3 months, documenting everything, building your case while pretending to be some harmless logistics clerk. That was the mission." The simple acknowledgement carried more weight than any elaborate explanation. Harlow had spent 3 months living among people who dismissed her as insignificant, enduring harassment and mockery, while methodically gathering evidence that would destroy them. Her performance had been so convincing that even experienced military personnel had been completely deceived, never suspecting that the woman they were bullying possessed authority that extended far beyond their understanding. As Ashford was led away to secure transportation, the remaining personnel began processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The logistics specialist they'd been dismissing as incompetent was actually a major conducting counterintelligence operations. The woman they'd been mocking as weak was actually one of the most dangerous individuals any of them would ever encounter. Webb, finally finding his voice, managed a single word. "Sorry." Harlow looked at him with an expression that combined professional assessment with something that might have been amusement. "Lieutenant, your behavior today will be noted in my final report. I suggest you use this experience to reconsider your approach to leadership and respect for fellow soldiers." It was a response that was simultaneously merciful and terrifying. She had the authority to destroy his career completely, but was choosing to treat his assault as a learning opportunity rather than a criminal offense. Rodriguez approached slowly, his 20 years of experience providing just enough background to understand that he was addressing someone whose actual capabilities were far beyond anything he'd ever encountered. "Ma'am, I need to apologize for everyone who treated you with disrespect during your time here. We didn't know, but that's no excuse for the way you were treated." Harlow's response revealed the deeper purpose behind her mission. Not just counterintelligence, but a comprehensive assessment of military culture and leadership effectiveness. "Sergeant, the treatment I received was exactly what the mission required. How personnel respond to those they perceive as weak reveals more about character than how they respond to obvious authority." The observation hit home with devastating accuracy. Every person who'd participated in mocking her now understood they'd been evaluated not just on their professional competence, but on their fundamental character as human beings. "The individuals who showed kindness and respect despite my apparent weakness demonstrated the kind of character that real leadership requires," she continued, her gaze finding Paisley Aldridge and a few others who'd tried to defend her during the harassment campaigns. Those who used perceived weakness as an opportunity for cruelty revealed character flaws that make them unsuitable for positions of authority over other soldiers. It was a comprehensive evaluation that went far beyond the supposed purpose of NATO cross-training. Harlow had been conducting a systematic assessment of leadership potential, identifying personnel worthy of advancement and those whose careers should be limited by their demonstrated character failures. Commander Beckham approached as the security situation stabilized, his expression indicating that the immediate crisis had been resolved, but larger implications remained to be addressed. "Major, your mission is complete. Excellent work, as always." "Thank you, sir. What's next?" Beckham produced a sealed envelope from his jacket, the kind of official correspondence that carried weight beyond its physical appearance. "New assignment, different theater, different challenges. Are you ready for immediate deployment?" Harlow accepted the envelope without reading it, her response automatic and professional. "Always ready, sir." But before she could open the orders, an encrypted communication device in Beckham's equipment began transmitting an incoming message. The commander answered with practiced efficiency, but his expression darkened as he absorbed the information being transmitted. "Understood. Confirm timeline. Roger, out." He turned back to Harlow, his demeanor shifting to reflect new urgency. Change of plans. We've got a situation developing that requires immediate attention. Local or international? International. Multiple Allied operations have been compromised simultaneously. Someone with access to NATO planning is feeding information to hostile forces in real time. The implications were staggering. If multiple operations were being compromised simultaneously, it suggested a security leak that went far beyond the corruption they'd just uncovered. There was another traitor, possibly multiple traitors, operating at levels that threatened the foundation of Allied military cooperation. The evidence package you just provided is crucial, but it's only part of a larger network we're still trying to map. Are you prepared for extended operations? Harlow's response was immediate and definitive. Whatever's needed. As the conversation continued, the remaining personnel began to understand that they'd witnessed not just the conclusion of one mission, but the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. The woman they'd known as Harlow Thorne, logistics specialist, was about to disappear completely. In her place would be Major Mitchell, Reaper Queen, an operative whose actual mission parameters remained classified at levels that most of them would never be cleared to understand. But as she prepared to leave with Commander Beckham's team, she took a moment to address the assembled personnel one final time. "Real warriors don't need to announce their strength," she said, her voice carrying across the compound with perfect clarity. "They prove it through service, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand between evil and innocence, regardless of personal cost." The words settled into the minds of everyone present like seeds that would grow into deeper understanding over time. They'd witnessed something extraordinary, not just the revelation of hidden identity, but a masterclass in what genuine strength looked like when it chose humility over arrogance. As the helicopters prepared for departure, their rotors spinning up with mechanical precision, Harlow made one final gesture that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their careers. She approached Webb, the young lieutenant who'd assaulted her and torn her shirt, exposing her tattoo and destroying her cover identity. Instead of anger or retribution, she extended her hand in a gesture of respect and reconciliation. "Learn from this, Lieutenant. Real leadership means protecting those who appear weak, not exploiting them for entertainment." Webb accepted the handshake with hands that trembled slightly, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine humility and growing understanding of how badly he'd misjudged the situation. As the aircraft lifted off, carrying away the woman who'd spent 3 months living among them, while maintaining one of the most sophisticated cover identities in modern military history, the assembled personnel began processing the lessons they'd learned. Some would carry those lessons forward, becoming better leaders and more thoughtful human beings because of their encounter with someone whose strength had been hidden beneath perfect vulnerability. Others would struggle with the knowledge that they'd revealed character flaws that might limit their potential for advancement and authority over other soldiers. But all of them would remember the day they learned that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one everyone underestimates, and that true strength rarely announces itself until the moment when announcement becomes necessary. The compound settled into an unusual quiet as personnel began the process of returning to normal operations. But normal would never quite feel the same after witnessing what happened when perfect cover met necessary revelation. The final sound to fade was the distant throb of helicopter rotors carrying Major Mitchell toward her next mission, her next identity, her next opportunity to stand between evil and innocence while allowing the world to believe she was nothing more than another unremarkable face in the crowd. 6 months later, reports would surface of a mysterious operative who'd infiltrated and dismantled an international trafficking network. A year after that, intelligence sources would whisper about someone who'd prevented a terrorist attack through months of patient undercover work, but officially, none of those operations would exist, and the woman responsible would remain a ghost whose true story could never be told in full. Because that's what real warriors do. They serve in silence, sacrifice without recognition, and disappear back into the shadows when their work is done, leaving only the memory of what genuine strength looks like when it chooses to remain hidden until the moment when hiding is no longer possible. The legend of Reaper Queen continued, written in classified files and whispered stories, but never in official histories. Because the most important victories are often the ones that prevent tragedies rather than respond to them, and those victories can only be achieved by people willing to be underestimated until the moment when estimation becomes irrelevant.